Have you ever felt that awkward silence when someone asks which team you support? That sensation of being on a different planet when everyone around you is screaming, cheering, suffering, and living intensely, something that, to you, is just 22 men chasing a ball? Have you ever pretended to understand, forced to smile, tried to join a conversation about plays, championships, and idols that make absolutely no sense in your inner reality? There is a deep and silent loneliness within people who have never been able to connect with soccer. A feeling of being constantly outside of something that seems to be humanity's universal language. While the entire world unites in stadiums, bars, homes, and public squares to experience a shared collective emotion, you remain there, watching from a distance, trying to decode an emotional code that seems to have been broken inside you from birth. It's not about disliking sports. It's not about being quirky or wanting attention. It's about a genuine and inexplicable disconnection from something that moves billions of people across the planet. It's about feeling alienated from the human species itself, for not being able to feel the excitement over something that should be instinctive, natural, automatic. It's about carrying a silent guilt for not feeling what everyone else feels, for not belonging where everyone belongs, for being eternally excluded from what others share. And the most painful part is realizing that this disconnection from soccer often reflects a much broader and deeper disconnection from collective life itself, from belonging, from the ability to surrender to irrational passions that unite people in something greater than themselves. What you never knew is that your inability to connect with soccer reveals something far more complex about the architecture of your psyche than simply not liking sports. In fact, soccer functions as one of the most powerful collective psychological fusion experiences humanity has ever created. It is a modern ritual that simultaneously activates the neurological centers of tribal identity, emotional catharsis, symbolic projection, and group belonging. When someone connects deeply with soccer, they are experiencing something Carl Jung would call mystical participation, a temporary dissolution of the individual ego boundaries in favor of a collective consciousness. The stadium becomes a symbolic womb, where thousands of people return to the oceanic feeling of being part of something much larger than their individual existences. It is an unconscious return to the primordial state of fusion we experienced in the womb and during the first months of life. But you, who never managed to connect with that, likely carry a psychological structure that develops strong defenses against that kind of ego dissolution. Your psyche learned, at some point in life, that surrendering to collective experiences is dangerous, that losing the contours of individuality represents a threat to emotional survival. There is something inside you that remains constantly vigilant, that never lets its guard down enough to be carried away by the collective intoxication that soccer provides. This is not a flaw. It is an adaptation. Your mind developed a protection system that keeps you always aware, always observing, always slightly detached from experiences that demand full, irrational surrender. You became someone who needs to understand before feeling, who needs logic before emotion, who needs to stay in control before allowing catharsis. Soccer is, essentially, an invitation to regress psychologically, to be a child again, to scream without rational reason, to cry over something that objectively doesn't affect your real life, to hate and love intensely people you've never met. It is a space where irrationality is not only allowed but celebrated, and your psyche, for a very specific and important reason, never managed to accept that invitation. What you carry, unknowingly, is an emotional hypervigilance that developed very early in your life. There is something in your personal history that taught your mind that fully surrendering to any collective experience is risky, that dissolving the boundaries of your individual ego might lead to psychological annihilation. You learn to be the observer, never the participant, the analyst, never the immersed one, the brain, never just the heart. This inability to connect with soccer is, in fact, a window into a much broader pattern in your life. You probably find it hard to fully surrender to experiences that require the suspension of rationality. Parties where people dance without caring how they look, religious rituals where faith overrides logic, intimate moments where all defenses must come down. Artistic experiences that ask you to stop analyzing and just feel. Your mind developed what psychologists call a hypertrophied observing ego. It's as if a part of you is always sitting in the bleachers of your own life, analyzing, interpreting, keeping a safe distance from anything that could emotionally overwhelm you. You became an expert in being present without truly being present, in participating while always keeping an emotional reserve, in living with one foot in and one foot out of any experience that demands total surrender. This didn't happen by accident. At some point in your development, likely during childhood, you learned that surrendering completely to something or someone could result in abandonment, rejection, or emotional annihilation. Maybe you grew up in an environment where intense emotions were dangerous, where the adults around you couldn't contain their own emotional breakdowns and you had to become the rational adult in the situation. Or maybe you experienced some kind of betrayal during moments of deep vulnerability, where surrendering completely led to profound pain. Your psyche then developed a sophisticated protection system. Never surrender again to experiences that require a loss of rational control. Soccer represents everything you learned to fear. It's organized emotional chaos. It's collective catharsis. It's irrational surrender. It's pure feeling without the need for logical justification. It's everything your mind categorized as dangerous from a very early age. And that's why you remain forever on the outside, watching people do something that feels impossible to you. Turn off the brain and just feel. There is a part of you that deeply envies this ability, that watches the innocent and intense joy of people screaming over a goal and feels a painful nostalgia for something you never had. The internal permission to be completely irrational, completely surrendered, completely human, in the most primitive and beautiful sense of the word. But there is also a part of you that feels proud of this difference, that feels superior for not being swept away by such trivial things. It is the ego compensating for the pain of isolation with a sense of intellectual superiority. I'm more evolved because I don't need soccer to be happy. I'm more rational because I don't let myself be carried away by blind passions. It's a sophisticated defense against the deep pain of feeling excluded from the most basic human experience of tribal belonging. The root of this complex relationship with intense collective experiences is likely buried somewhere in your childhood, in moments you may not even clearly remember, but that forever shaped how you relate to emotional surrender. Maybe you grew up in a home where the adults' emotions were unpredictable and frightening, where you never knew when a moment of family joy would turn into yelling, violence, or emotional abandonment. Children who grow up in emotionally unstable environments develop an almost paranormal ability to constantly monitor the emotional climate around them. They become little human sensors, always alert, always ready to protect themselves when adult emotions start to spin out of control. And soccer, with all its emotional intensity, can unconsciously trigger those same alert systems that were designed to protect you from the emotional chaos of childhood. Or maybe you were an especially sensitive child who had to grow up too fast, who had to become the emotional adult in the family when the real adults couldn't fulfill that role. You learned that showing intense emotions was dangerous, that shouting with joy or frustration could trigger violent reactions or emotional abandonment. Your child mind categorized any intense emotional expression as a threat to the family's emotional stability. There's also the possibility that you experienced some kind of betrayal or humiliation in collective contexts during childhood. Maybe you were rejected by a group of kids when you tried to join in collective games. Maybe you were ridiculed for not understanding the unwritten rules of childhood play. Maybe you were systematically excluded from activities that required motor coordination or an understanding of group dynamics. These early experiences of exclusion may have created an unconscious association between intense collective activities and the pain of rejection. Your mind learned that it's safer to remain on the sidelines, observing, than to risk participating and being rejected or humiliated again. Soccer, as the most universal and intense collective activity in our culture, became the ultimate symbol of everything you learned to avoid. But perhaps the most likely explanation is that you were simply born with a specific neurological sensitivity that makes intense sensory experiences like the noise of stadiums, the chaotic energy of crowds, and excessive visual stimulation genuinely uncomfortable for you. Some people are born with nervous systems that process stimuli more intensely and are easily overwhelmed by overly stimulating environments. If something inside you is reacting to this, you're not alone. Write "I feel this" in the comments. This is not a flaw in your neurological system. It's just a difference. But in a culture that worships soccer as the ultimate expression of social normalcy, This neurological difference may have become a constant source of isolation and misunderstanding. You grew up feeling like something was wrong with you because you couldn't tolerate or enjoy something that everyone else seemed to love naturally. What happens in the brain of someone watching soccer is fascinating and reveals a lot about why you never managed to connect with this experience. When a person is genuinely engaged in a match, their brain simultaneously activates several complex neural networks. The reward system releases dopamine with each exciting play. Mirror neurons make them literally feel the player's movements in their own body. And the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking, significantly reduces its activity. It is literally an altered state of consciousness. The person temporarily stops being a rational individual and becomes part of a collective organism that feels, thinks, and reacts as a unit. The brain enters a mode that neuroscientists call collective cognition, where the barriers between self and other partially dissolve. It's a state very similar to what happens during mystical experiences, intense religious rituals, or even under the influence of certain psychoactive substances. But your brain, for some specific reason, has never been able to access that state. While others can turn off their prefrontal cortex temporarily and get carried away by the purely sensory and emotional experience of soccer, you remain constantly anchored in rationality. Your mind maintains a constant vigilance that prevents the necessary surrender for a genuine soccer experience. This may be related to differences in how your brain processes neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, which are fundamental to experiences of collective euphoria. Or it could be linked to chronic hyperactivation of the prefrontal cortex, which keeps you always in analysis mode, even when it would be more pleasurable to simply feel. There's also an important issue regarding how your brain processes social information. Soccer is essentially a complex system of social signals. Knowing when to cheer, when to feel emotion, when to suffer, when to celebrate, all of that depends on a sophisticated and intuitive reading of nonverbal social cues. Some people are born with a natural ease in decoding these signals, while others must make a constant conscious effort to understand what's going on socially around them. If you've never been able to connect with soccer, there's a strong possibility that you process social information differently from most people. You might be someone who needs to understand rationally before feeling emotionally, who needs logic before intuition, who needs predictability before spontaneity. In today's world, this difference has become even more pronounced because soccer has become the universal social language. It is the most common way men connect with one another. The small talk in elevators, the shared passion that unites people from entirely different social classes and backgrounds. Not connecting with soccer means automatically being excluded from a significant percentage of casual social interactions in adult life. And that generates constant social stress. You constantly have to invent excuses, change the subject, fake interest, or simply accept the social isolation that comes with this difference. It's a silent emotional exhaustion that few people understand, because for most, soccer is as natural as breathing. There's something profoundly liberating in finally understanding that your inability to connect with soccer is not a moral, intellectual, or emotional failure. It's simply the way your psyche organized itself to protect you from something that, at some point in your story, represented a real threat. Your mind developed a sophisticated defense system that keeps you safe, even if that means remaining eternally on the outside of one of humanity's most intense collective experiences. But there's also a silent tragedy in that protection. In defending yourself from the vulnerability that soccer demands, you may have also defended yourself from other forms of emotional surrender that could deeply nourish you. The same vigilance that prevents you from cheering for a goal might also be stopping you from crying freely when needed, laughing uncontrollably when something amuses you, falling completely in love with someone, or passionately dedicating yourself to a job that inspires you. Life constantly demands small ego deaths. Moments where you need to stop being the controlled observer and allow yourself to just be a human being feeling intensely. And maybe soccer is just the most visible symptom of a much deeper struggle you carry. The difficulty of temporarily dying to be reborn, transformed by experience. This doesn't mean you need to force an artificial connection with soccer. That would just be another form of violence against yourself, another attempt to fit into a mold that wasn't made for you. But it may mean perhaps, that you can start investigating other areas of your life where this same resistance to full surrender might be depriving you of deeply nourishing experiences. Where else do you stay in the position of observer when you could be a participant? In what other context do you choose the safety of analysis over the vulnerability of feeling? What other forms of emotional collective catharsis have you avoided out of fear of losing control? Maybe you can start small. Maybe it's a concert by a band you truly love, where you finally allow yourself to sing along without caring about pitch. Maybe it's a movie session where you let yourself cry publicly without trying to hold back the tears. Maybe it's a party where you allow yourself to dance badly without worrying about others' judgment. It's not about forcing yourself to like soccer. It's about allowing yourself experiences where the heart leads and the brain simply follows. It's about discovering that you can fully surrender to something and still remain whole, that you can die temporarily and still be reborn at the end of the experience. There is ancient wisdom in the way you protect your emotions, in the way you keep a distance from experiences that could overwhelm you. But there is also a wisdom you haven't yet explored. The wisdom of trusting the world and yourself enough to allow the temporary loss of control that all transformative experiences demand. In the end, your inability to connect with soccer is an accurate map of the emotional geography you developed to survive in the world. It's proof that you learned very early to protect yourself from forms of dissolution that could be dangerous, and there is deep wisdom in that protection. You became someone who can stay lucid in situations where others get lost, someone who can remain whole when others fragment in collective intensity. But there's also a quiet opportunity hidden in that difference. The opportunity to investigate with curiosity and without judgment other areas of your life where you might be missing out on nourishing experiences due to overprotection, where you might be choosing the safety of observation over the richness of participation. You don't have to force yourself to love soccer to be a complete person. You don't have to fake passions you don't feel to belong in the world. But perhaps you can start exploring safer, more gradual ways to experience the emotional surrender your soul, deep down, also craves. Because in the end, we all carry the same ancestral hunger for dissolution and belonging. We all want, on some deep level, to feel part of something greater than ourselves. The difference is that some have found that in soccer, and you are still searching for where your emotional stadium is, where your heart's grandstand might be. If something inside you is reacting to this, know that you are not alone in this silent search for safe ways to surrender to the world. Maybe you'll never understand the joy of soccer, but maybe that's just the beginning of discovering your own secret joy, one that no one else understands, but that is deeply yours and profoundly true.